I think it's fair to say that if you were to ask someone what's the most important things in a free society, free speech would be pretty near the top. And I agree with that. I think it is absolutely one of the most important things in a free society, indeed in democracy. Now, this video is not about the pros and cons of democracy. I know that totalitarian, let's say, single party states will often look at the flaws of democracy. They'll look, for example, at riots in countries like India and the UK and say this shows the instability of democracy. And it's a distortion, of course, because you can weigh up any totalitarian state with a democracy, and ultimately, in almost every factor, the democracy will be stronger. I don't think any person given a choice would want to be in a more controlling system. They want stability, of course. They don't want to see crime. They don't want to see unrest or political instability. But that's not the same as wanting totalitarianism. So this video will be focusing on the issue of free speech. I've actually tried uploading this several times now. I keep running out of space because there's a lot of angles to take. So what I'm going to do is focus on this one on free speech. The second video I'll be making, which will kind of be a part two to this, will be about the issue of censorship, which of course is closely related. Now I'm going to be focusing on the recent unrest because I've noticed there's sort of a lot of people very angry with Starmer. Um, and, you know, these people may have been partisan in the first place. They may not have voted Labour in the first place. But there's sort of been this backlash against Starmer and his government in the wake of the riots. Certainly they've went down in terms of perception of handling crime. I actually think that in some ways this government's handled the unrest as best they could. And people conveniently forget that the England riots of 2011, the Conservative government were very quick to take a hard line, and rioters faced sentencing pretty quickly then. Now, the overcrowding situation wasn't as bad then as it is now, so that's a slightly different component. And the nature of the riots are different. In 2011, it was about austerity. This time, it's about false information spread out over the attacks in Southport, among other things. Of course, I can hear people shout, "No, Nathan, it's about illegal immigration." The point I'm making here is, in both cases, you had widespread riots in urban areas, and in both cases, you had sentences being handed out pretty promptly afterwards. I think the idea that the government should just do nothing in terms of the punishment factor is complete nonsense. I think if you're of the Nigel Farage school of thought, it should be, well, the government's response should be to stop all immigrants. Surely the first responsibility in this situation is maintaining law and order. That's why when someone like Elon Musk swoops in and talks about civil war, who the hell is he helping with that statement? Complete nonsense. Um, the thing about believing in free speech is you need to accept that that includes supporting the right of those who disagree with you and see the world in a very different way. It's no good saying you believe in free speech if you're just going to support opinions that you agree with. Of course, that goes without saying. But it needs to be understood that a lot of the sentencing that's been going on, if it hasn't been for explicit violence, acts of violence, it's been for inciting of violence. Now, if you go down the absolutist path, if you're a free speech absolutist, then by definition you would have to support incitement because it's just words. Except we know that it isn't just words. We know from history that incitement can have real world consequences. In the Rwandan genocide, and this is an example I've used before, but I think it's important, radio stations led by Hutu extremists, the Interahamwe militias, incited violence against the Tutsis by talking about them as the tall trees, as was featured in the film Hotel Rwanda with Don Cheadle. Now, that was a euphemism because the Tutsis were physically taller than the Hutus. Well, the radio stations in of themselves didn't cause the whole genocide, but they definitely fueled it. They definitely fueled up the madness and the violence. And as we know, up to 800,000 people died in 3 months of 1994 in the deep south of the United States. in the Jim Crow era, you had false rumors about black men raping white women or even looking at them the wrong way, and you had these barbaric lynchings in, city centre squares, grotesquely then promoted around postcards as if it was something to celebrate. Um, in Pakistan, you've had lynch mobs developing over people accused of blasphemy, whether they've actually insulted the Quran and the Prophet or not. And in some cases, they've been brutally killed. Um, all of this shows that mere words are not harmless. They're not. It's if they're used in a context of inciting violence. That's why if someone has taken to their followers during this unrest and said we should just go down and attack a mosque or burn down a hotel full of refugees, that is not harmless. And I'm sick and tired of the right, and it is particularly the right, trying to downplay this stuff. It's incitement, and it has real world consequences. In one case, one of the people doing this got 3 years. Now, whether they'll serve this full time or not is actually less important than the implications of those sentences being handed out. I think they should serve the full term, but it's not just words. It's not harmless. Now, I think that's very different than someone sharing false information and it's an honest mistake. I will say though, with Elon Musk, I hold him to a higher standard. Not that I respect him, I don't, but I I think someone in that position. I mean, when I was criticizing Musk, people said, "Oh, Nathan, have you never made mistakes?" I have, but you know what? I'm not a billionaire tech giant who has control over one of the world's biggest social media sites, X. He is. Therefore, the consequences of him getting it wrong have more influence than a guy with 2,000 subscribers getting it wrong. Um, there may be a case that you need to look at these situations individually. So, for example, if someone gets drunk and they say something stupid online in a moment's madness, I'm not sure that they should be held to account in the same way as someone who knows full well what they're doing and is deliberately trying to incite violence. Um, I hope judges are looking at each of these cases on their own merits. I'm a tiny bit concerned that there's been a little bit of sweeping justice in that sense. I've no sympathy for rioters, none, zero. I've no sympathy for people who are inciting violence, but I do hope that judges are looking at each of the circumstances in each case rather than just saying, "Oh, well, this has happened across the country, so we're going to have the same punishment." It should be the same punishment for the same circumstances, of course, but that's the point. They have to look at the circumstances of each defendant. Um, this was the headline of the Eye a couple of days ago. Just holding that up, you can freeze the video so you can read that. I'll just read this out. Musk's ex using far-right hate to sell adverts. Tech billionaire faces backlash against after ads for Telegraph, Saudi Arabia travel and finance firms appear alongside far-right viral messaging. I've actually mentioned this in one of the previous videos, but taps directly into the point of this video. Social media giants' revenue is being boosted by running adverts alongside tweets from British fascists, including Paul Golding, who was jailed for a series of hate crimes against Muslims before Musk lifted the ban. Major companies shocked to learn that their promotions are being run next to far-right content, and several pause their advertising with X. Messages include racist content and misinformation about UK riots. Musk under scrutiny for hosting hate speech on site as he escalates clash with UK Prime Minister and sues Unilever and Mars over boycott. I've heard some describe X as a cesspit. Now, this may come more into my second video around censorship, but I do think social media giants have a responsibility. This responsibility has to be matched with respecting free speech, and it isn't an easy thing to do. Um, Let me just put it out there what I think of free speech. I think it should be as broad reaching as possible. So, there will be some who attack me as being woke or pro control or something like that. If that's their position, they're deluded and wrong. I think free speech should even include the right to offend or be offensive. I don't think people should deliberately do that, but I certainly don't think someone should be going to jail for making a racist joke, for example. It wouldn't necessarily be something I would go along with. I certainly wouldn't promote it, but should we really waste police resources on that? I've long argued that the police shouldn't be going to someone's house because they use the wrong pronoun, for example, online. Now, that may be offensive to a trans person, but is it really a police matter? I think it's very alarming when police spoke about, various police forces would speak about investigating non-crime hate incidents, and it does show where hate crime legislation needs to be very closely scrutinised. Absolutely. I do think there is a threat to free speech with that. But I am not a free speech absolutist, because if I was, I would by definition have to support hate speech. Why? Because hate speech includes words. Words are free speech, right? So what people miss in the whole free speech issue is, yes, there is the freedom to say what's on your mind and to stand up for your conviction, but I do believe there's also responsibility with that. Now, what I'm not a fan of is using people's past words to kind of vilify them. This is particularly done in politics, where someone said something 10 years ago or 15 years ago or 20 years ago, and it may have been politically incorrect. Or let me give an example. Let's say someone is a 15-year-old tells a racist joke, okay, and they tell that on social media. Then in their mid-30s, they want to run for office. And then their opponents say, oh, look, they said this back in 2005. I'm thinking, really, is you're scraping the barrel. What I'm interested in is, do they hold racist views now? I am not interested in demonizing someone or vilifying them because they said something questionable 10, 20, 30 years ago. Um, so that to me is a little bit cynical, and I think everyone should be allowed to make mistakes, particularly in youth, particularly when it is something like that. Uh, um, But with free speech, it's very, very important that it is as broad reaching as possible. So if you genuinely believe in it, then you would agree that people shouldn't be punished simply for holding a view that may be offensive to some. And I do think, like I say, there's question marks over how hate crime legislation is is drafted. I'd be very concerned, for example, if people were held because they criticised Islam. That's clearly different from saying I hate Muslims. Although I'm not even sure that should be an arrestable offence. I think that if someone's expressing hate, they probably need an education. They probably need to get into the world and meet people. But I don't even think that expressing hate should, in of itself, be an arrestable offence. The, for me, a red line is inciting violence, is saying, you should go and do this thing, or let's burn a mosque down, or let's attack refugees, or something like that. That is a red line. And any decent person should see that that's a red line. And this is why I was so angry with the likes of GB News, because they fail to understand that a lot of the arrests have indeed been for incitement, not just because someone had a questionable opinion. Um, but having said that, you know, if the police are looking, for example, at people sharing photos of riots, well, what about journalists? Journalists have to, as part of their job, interview people, take pictures, etc. And we need to be very careful. Another important thing in democracy is protecting the freedom of the press. That includes freelance journalists. It's not just the big boys, the BBC, and so on. So I'm passionate about that. But all I would say with the free speech thing is, if you're going to passionately argue free speech is absolute, okay, but will you just as passionately argue that if people say stupid things and they say inflammatory things, they alone are responsible for the words that come out of their mouth? I hold myself responsible for everything that I come out with on this channel. Everything. 100%. I can't complain someone goaded me into it, or I was misled, or whatever. Um, I'm responsible for the words that I say on this channel, and I take that responsibility. If I get it wrong, I will say so. Um, so yeah, I'm going to wrap this up, but I think that's the thing with free speech. Yes, there has to be a protection of holding controversial or offensive views. I think, for example, if someone is being racist, I don't think it should be an arrestable offence, unless, of course, it's like in the context of abusing someone to their face. I mean, I certainly don't think a drunk gang should be allowed to yell racist abuse at someone. That's clearly harassment. But if it's in their own home and they're saying it to friends, like some racist joke, should that really be an arrestable offence? No, I think it's objectionable. I think they could be criticised. I would also say if they're in a particular job, like the police, for example, or the military, which involves working with other people, particularly involving working in the community, then they lose a job, then they've no one to blame but themselves. So I'm fine with that. But I think actual criminal liability should be a particular thing. It should be violence. It should be specific crimes that are hurting people. And I'm not talking about hurt feelings. I'm talking about physically hurting people or threatening people. The problem with legislating on hurt feelings is some people are more sensitive than others. And who gets to call the shots on that? That would be a slippery slope. But that doesn't mean I'm okay with bullies and okay with people who are deliberately being obnoxious. I don't think they should necessarily, it shouldn't be arrestable, but I think they should be called out. A big part of free speech, and I'm going to round it up with this, is the right for others to criticise. That's also a big part of it. So stay tuned for my thoughts on the idea of censorship around this. I certainly don't think people should be punished in the riots for sharing false information or sharing pictures of the riots, but I do think they should be punished if they are explicitly inciting violence. Explicitly. There's a clear difference.